Good morning, everyone. So welcome to the first talk. So today we have Damien Irving. So he's worked in meteorology at CSIRO and is currently completing his PhD at the University of Melbourne. Today's talk will be Software Carpentry in Australia, Current Activity and Future Directions. Please welcome him.
Thanks. Morning, everyone. Yeah, so for the next 25 minutes or so, I'm going to be talking about Software Carpentry, which is a volunteer organisation that basically teaches computing skills to researchers in science, engineering, medicine, you name it. And so 12 months ago at PyCon down in Hobart, I spoke very excitedly about Software Carpentry. And during that talk, I talked about three main things. I kind of started off talking about the low computational competency of the science community and the research community in general, and how that was really, I guess, hampering progress. And a lot of that talk was in the context of my own experiences as a few years ago now, kind of graduating from an undergraduate Bachelor of Science with really no programming skills whatsoever, which is still a pretty common occurrence today. And then landing a job at CSIRO, and they, on the first day, they give me the keys to one of the supercomputers at the National Computing Infrastructure at ANU. And then, as you can imagine, that didn't go so well. And because that experience that I had is similar to many, science graduates, in Australia and abroad, that is really, I guess, the thing and the experience that really motivated the need for an organisation like Software Carpentry. So then I spoke about the history of the organisation, and so Software Carpentry has actually been around since 1998. It was really kind of bumbling along from grant to grant. And then in the early 2012, they switched to a teaching model of these 2-day intensive boot camps, and then all of a sudden the popularity of the thing just exploded, really. And so it was an exciting thing to be a part of. And so by early 2013, it was still very centred in North America and Europe. But myself and a guy from Sydney organised for Greg Wilson, who's the founder of Software Carpentry, to come out to Australia to teach the first 2 boot camps outside of Europe and North America. And so I spoke a bit about those boot camps in Hobart. And so what I wanted to do today then was, I guess, review our first 18 months or so of Software Carpentry in Australia since those very first boot camps, with a particular focus, I guess, on the lessons we've learned along the way, both in Australia and globally more generally. And then I want to talk about kind of future directions, both globally and in Australia, where we're going with Software Carpentry in the future, and then talk a little bit about how hopefully some of you might like to get involved. So in terms of the global picture, since we started running these, the boot camp format in 2012, there's been 220 boot camps worldwide, 234 volunteers and instructors have been involved in those, and we've reached just a tick under 7,000 learners. And there's the distribution if you're interested. So as you can see, it does kind of cluster in North America and Europe a fair bit, but particularly in the last 12 months, we've really started to expand, hopefully, into other areas of the globe, and particularly in Australia, as you can see. And so in Australia, as of the end of September, so there's a couple of boot camps coming that I wanted to include in the stats, we will have done 14 boot camps across 6 capital cities. So the only capital cities we're missing as of, well, we did Brisbane this week. We had one at UQ on Wednesday and Thursday, so we ticked off Brisbane, and all we've got left now is Perth and Darwin to complete the set. And those 14 boot camps have involved, I guess, 15 volunteers in a big way. So either they did a lot of the instructing or kind of were a lead organiser for the boot camp, and lots of other helpers who have had smaller roles in making those events happen. So Software Carpentry isn't huge, but it isn't small either, and it's growing pretty rapidly, so it's a pretty exciting thing to be a part of from that respect. So what do we teach at a boot camp? I guess in the advertising for a boot camp, we tell the participants that we're going to teach them the Unix shell, we're going to teach them Python or R. Probably about 85% of boot camps are in Python, so there are some in R, but the bulk of them use Python. Git and GitHub, and then also some SQL. But really what we actually teach them is task automation, how to write programs in, I guess, a modular, testable, readable way, how to track and share their data and code effectively, and a bit of the difference between structured and unstructured data. And so it's a bit of a bait and switch, I guess. If we advertise, though, that we're really teaching them concepts on the right-hand side there, it'd probably be hard to get people to come along. But if we tell them that we're teaching them something cool like the IPython notebook or GitHub or something like that, then it's a bit easier to fill the room. And then actually, if you're interested in more details about what gets taught, there's a link there to a group of the instructors got together and wrote a paper in PLOS Biology that was published earlier this year on, I think it's called Best Practices in Scientific Computing. It's a really good summary of kind of what we teach. And also the lessons page of the website is a good resource as well. In terms of, I guess, lessons we've learnt along the way, probably, I mean, if you ever have seen any of Greg Wilson's talks at a SciPy conference or something like that, he always says that the first lesson that he learned, and it took him quite a while to learn it, was that most scientists think of programming as a tax they have to pay in order to do their science. If they were kind of actually passionate and super interested in programming, they probably would have done computer science at university instead of physiology or biology or whatever it is that they're actually passionate about. And so they don't really kind of care about the things that a lot of programmers care about. They don't care how the call stack works. They don't probably even know what recursion is, let alone think it's interesting. And so probably one of the keys to success for Software Carpentry has been the fact that most of the instructors are actual scientists or researchers in their day job as opposed to programmers. And so they have a good understanding of what, I guess, the audience actually needs to know and what they actually care about and what they absolutely don't need to know and what they couldn't care less about. So that works really well. Having said that, there are quite a few of the instructors who are programmers by trade and are excellent instructors, so I don't want to generalize too much there. And from a personal perspective, I know that when I'm teaching a bootcamp, it's very reassuring to have someone with a strong, at least one of the helpers in the room, have a strong programming background. So when I get one of those curly questions that I just don't know, there's someone in the room who can back me up. But actually, one of the participants at the bootcamp at UQ on Wednesday and Thursday probably summed it up pretty well, in that these researchers are really looking for a non-techie introduction to programming. So if any of them have had much interaction with programmers or IT people, which often they haven't, but if they have, most of their experience has been, the language used to speak to them about things and stuff has just been straight over their head and they have no idea what's happening and it's very intimidating. And so the second, I guess, lesson we've found is that the demand for this non-techie introduction to programming is actually really, really strong. So our bootcamp last week, we had a room for 30. It sold out a couple of weeks in advance. We've got a bootcamp coming up at Melbourne Uni in mid-September. We've got a room for 45 people. That's already sold out, and we're 2 months from the event. So the demand is very big, and probably the limiting factor is the number of instructors that we've got, really. If we could put on almost an infinite number of boot camps, and we could keep filling the rooms. And if you needed, I guess, more evidence that the demand is huge, any of you who have been involved in academia at all would be well aware of the PhD comics, comic strip. And actually, in the last 6 months, I can think of 3 or 4 of those comics which have really centered around the struggle of the main character with programming. And as well as usually being very funny, these comics are usually very perceptive and really pick up on the mood of, I guess, the global PhD community. And so if programming is getting mentioned in every second comic, as it seems to be these days, then that probably goes some way to explaining why there is such demand. Third thing we've probably learnt is that the curriculum is full. And so most people would agree that we should be teaching more programming to undergraduates, high school as well. But when it actually comes to the hard decision of, well, what do we take out of the existing courses to put programming in, that's really where the problem arises. Because, I mean, my background's in meteorology. I'm not sure that I'd want to take out, the lessons on theories of thunderstorm development or how the greenhouse effect works or anything like that to put in programming. These are difficult decisions. So really the boot camps, I guess, in a sense, are working outside the system, outside the academic system, and then we're kind of hoping, I guess, that when the PhDs and postdocs who come through our boot camps, are on the curriculum committee at a university in 15 years' time, then we start seeing programming getting integrated into courses. And I guess it's kind of a long game we're playing, and it's pretty frustrating, but it's probably the only way in, I think. Fourth lesson is that these things seem to work. And so the typical, I guess, way that a bootcamp is run is that the instructor usually does a short period of live coding to introduce some kind of new topic. So, and there's normally no more than 10 or 15 minutes, and certainly no PowerPoint slides or anything like that. It's all live coding. And then after that short burst of live coding, the participants kind of break off in pairs and work on challenges. And during those challenges, the helper's in the room. So we try and have one helper for every 5 or 6 participants, circulate and discuss the challenges with the participants. And that's probably actually where most of the learning occurs. But there's a couple of really nice things about that. The first one, the live coding, is really good for a number of reasons. One is that most researchers have never really seen someone who is relatively knowledgeable about programming go about their day-to-day, how do they actually go about these things. And I think it's reassuring for them to see that even experienced people make mistakes. They can't remember what a particular command is. They're on Google or Stack Overflow all the time. I actually went rm star at at the UQ bootcamp and deleted a whole heap of stuff, and then luckily everything was under version control and everything was fine. But it's reassuring to see, for them to see you stuff up. And it's also really useful because, if you're reading online documentation and things, oftentimes if you're a beginner, it's hard to kind of read between the lines. If you've never kind of seen the library or whatever you're reading about in action, it's hard to kind of fill those gaps where the documentation doesn't. And so actually seeing someone working live can really help kind of fill the gaps for them. And the pair programming, working in pairs aspect is also really nice, just because researchers tend not to discuss their code at all. Most of them, if they're doing any coding, are quite ashamed of their code. They sure as hell wouldn't be showing anyone their code or really discussing coding at morning tea or something, because it's kind of a weird thing. No one has much experience usually in the coffee room, but everyone thinks that everyone else does, and so it's like it's a topic that just no one talks about. So that's another good aspect. And the other good aspect, I guess, is the free and open source tools that we use. So everyone that comes along to a boot camp brings their laptop. We get them to install Anaconda, and if they've got a Windows machine, also Git Bash. So they've got a terminal emulator and Git as well. And because of that, because they've got everything installed and working on their laptop, and we can give them assistance if they have trouble with that, there's no impediment to them using these things that they learn in their work straight away after the boot camp, because they're all set up and ready to go. So those are the things that work. Probably the thing that doesn't work, or is most difficult, is follow-up. How do we keep the people engaged after a boot camp? How do we continue to give them assistance, keep them in the discussion of computing best practices? And about 12 months ago, Software Carpentry trialled online office hours, where they would make some of the instructors available, for an hour a week or something. And if you're a student, if you're like a bootcamp alumni, you could log on. They'd pair you up with an instructor, get some kind of desktop sharing arrangement going, and you could have your questions answered. And maybe sometimes the other way around. But it was actually a really good service. I used it a couple of times, and it was a fantastic way to get assistance, but there just wasn't enough people using it to really make it worthwhile, and we're not running it anymore. So what we've got going on at Melbourne University at the moment, and there's a picture from a warmer time of year, we've got something going called Hacky Hour instead of Happy Hour at one of the bars on campus, and it's just a regular meet-up every week where researchers who are kind of into coding meet up, and other people who've got questions can come down and ask questions if they've got any, or a lot of the time the discussion just kind of descends into more of a discussion on open science and other kind of things that are strongly related to computing best practices. And it's slowly taking off. I wouldn't say it's a raging success, but we get a few people there every week, and it's kind of the best success we've had so far, but yeah, follow-up is very hard. But I guess if you're interested about the lessons we've learned and a bit more about software carpentry, Greg Wilson wrote a paper that was released in F1000 Research recently called Software Carpentry Lessons Learned. So yeah, go to that link if you want more information. But probably what's more interesting is, I guess, where are we going in the next 12 months and beyond? The first thing, I guess, is globally there's going to be many more boot camps. It's kind of, I guess, like compounding interest. The more boot camps we run, the more people get interested, the more we run, and the thing's growing exponentially. There's also a lot of work, now that we've got a fairly large pool of instructors, there's a lot more work happening on the lesson material. And so there's the GitHub repository if you're interested, Software Carpentry BCs for bootcamp. And so in terms of the materials, the core lessons, the ones that you'll see on the actual website and the ones we used like last week at UQ, they're in their 5th official version now, and they're quite a mature, really good resource. And so they're really kind of fine-tuned now. And so we're kind of branching off into new lessons. And so if those core lessons are what we call our novice level lessons for people that have, had a bit of a dabble in programming but are very much novice learners, we're producing some intermediate level lessons now that go through the content quite a bit faster and go into a lot more depth. We're working on capstone examples, and so basically what that means is if you can get a boot camp where you get an entire audience from the same discipline, so say you organise a boot camp in conjunction with a conference or something like that, the natural question that participants at those boot camps have is, after you've gone through all that generic kind of introductory material, they're kind of like, well, what does using Python and Git and everything look like in my actual discipline? And so at the moment we've got some capstone examples for like bioinformatics, climate, oceanography. So we're building up a bit of a library of those. There's also some people dabbling in developing some data carpentry materials which have a lot of overlap with the software carpentry materials, but there's just a bit more of a focus on data as opposed to software, if you like. So it'll be interesting to see what they come up with. MATLAB is one that a lot of people, when they're doing data analysis in the science community, use MATLAB. And for those who aren't familiar, it's owned by a company called MathWorks, so it's a proprietary software package. And so there's only been one boot camp on MATLAB so far. We're doing another one at Melbourne Uni in a few weeks' time. But there's a fair bit of debate in the software carpentry community, as you can imagine, as to whether we should be supporting a closed, proprietary package like MATLAB. And so, yeah, arguments like that are probably for another day. And then there's other lessons on regular expressions, on kind of workflow automation tools like Make, on parallel computing and all sorts of things. And what's, I guess, kind of interesting is that for all of us probably in this room, this idea of developing lesson materials by kind of diffing and patching and merging is pretty natural. That's how software development happens. But in the kind of education sphere, that doesn't really happen at all. There isn't really this culture of taking someone else's, well, there is a little bit of a culture of using someone else's lessons, but they're not contributing back to their lessons with a patch or something like that. And so it's kind of a little bit kind of unique what we're doing, and it's interesting to apply these things to a context other than programming. So it's fairly interesting from that standpoint too. But I guess all the things on that slide are the things that you would expect. As we get bigger, we're going to run more boot camps, we're going to have more people working on the lessons and so on. What's probably more interesting is, or more unique to what's happening in Australia, is that we seem to be the first place where software carpentry is actually getting supported at an institutional level. And so that's happening through a project called the Research Bazaar, which is powered by, if you like, a new department at the University of Melbourne. And so it's called ITS Research Services. And so if your central ITS, IT Services department, does your infrastructure like Wi-Fi and things, and changes your password and puts Windows on your machine for you, then what this new research services department brief is to actually help researchers with the digital tools they actually use for their research. And so in the arts and humanities, that's commonly like mapping tools like CartoDB and TileMill. In engineering and architecture and things, that's computer-aided design tools like SolidWorks and Autodesk. And in the physical sciences and the life sciences, that's data analysis packages in Python, R, MATLAB, and so on. And I guess obviously with such a wide range of tools and then lots of different libraries and things within those tools, it would be impossible to provide a help desk. We'd have to have a staff of 100 people with expertise in all sorts of things. So instead, the real, I guess, model that we're going with is developing communities around these tools. So getting all the researchers that use Python together regularly so they can be talking about these things and basically teaching each other. And because of that kind of aim, we have a fairly, I guess, unique staffing profile. And so we have developers on the team, obviously for helping researchers with things that are very complex and so on. But we also have a team of what's called research community coordinators, who I'm one of those. And so most of those research community coordinators are a bit like me in that we're doing our PhD, but we work 1 day a week with the ITS Research Services Department. And we're kind of their people on the ground. We're actually in the departments, we know the researchers, we know what they want help with. We have the contacts for if we need to advertise a workshop, all those types of things. And so, yeah, we've got this mix of kind of developers and community coordinators, which is kind of cool. I guess when I say that we're offering institutional support for software carpentry, what that kind of means is that part of my role, as well as being the research community coordinator for the physical sciences, is to make sure that software carpentry boot camps are happening regularly for the students at Melbourne Uni, and also more broadly, we definitely don't restrict ourselves to Melbourne Uni just because that's where we live at the moment. We have researchers from all universities around Victoria come to a lot of our boot camps. But yeah, we're really supporting in a sense that instead of the boot camps just happening on an ad hoc basis when a certain volunteer has time, we're really making sure that they happen regularly and there's this regular service for students for learning how to program. And so there's probably three main things involved in kind of keeping these things happening regularly. The first is that you obviously need a lot of helpers if you're going to be running these things every month or two. If we're aiming for that ratio of one helper for every 5 or 6 students, and we're running boot camps with 40 people every month or two, that's quite a few helpers. But actually we've found it fairly easy to put together. We've got teaching teams in Python, R and MATLAB, and lots of researchers are actually really willing to give up a day or two of their time every few months to help other researchers learn to code. So that's been a really nice thing to discover. We also obviously need to keep audiences coming in for all these boot camps, but as I was saying before, the demand is so great that hasn't been a particularly difficult thing. But we do liaise with like lecturers and departments, and if they've got a certain cohort of students who need upskilling in programming to complete a certain course, then we'll help them out. We often talk with student groups as well, like the postgraduate society for biologists or mathematicians or whatever. They're often putting on events for their members, and we can kind of team up with them in that way. But the main thing, and I guess the sticking point and the thing that slows us, if anything, is having enough instructors to do the teaching. And traditionally what happens is instructors go through a 12-week online instructor training course with Greg Wilson. Takes about 2 or 4 hours of their time every week, and they train up that way. But to kind of speed up the process in Australia, we're actually getting Greg to come out on the 11th to the 13th of February next year to run that 12-week course as a 3-day intensive for 30 aspiring Australian instructors. So the link there has all the information about that if you want to register your interest, or you can pass it on to anyone who might be interested. And we've actually got quite a few scholarships available to bring people from interstate and even from New Zealand as well, so that we can get a good sampling of people from right around the country as a real kind of Kickstarter for software carpentry in Australia. And then that 11th to 13th of February is a Wednesday to Friday. On the next Monday to Wednesday, we're running a doctoral training conference for PhD students at the University of Melbourne. So we're hoping some of those trainees will stick around and have their first teaching experience at the doctoral training conference, because we're going to be running a Python, R, and MATLAB bootcamp simultaneously at that event. So that should be a great event, if not very stressful. So I guess in summary, software carpentry is growing pretty rapidly in Australia, certainly far more rapidly than I thought when I spoke at this conference last year about it. And yeah, if you want to get involved, there's lots of ways. If you're part of a community you think would benefit from a boot camp, then get in touch about organising one. You can obviously help and instruct if you'd like to help out that way. Well, there's also lots of things that happen in the background if you're not so inclined to teach, but you've got a lot of technical expertise. There's a lot of things that happen in the background with our website, a lot of issues converting IPython notebooks to HTML and all sorts of very technical things that go on, and we're always looking for assistance with those types of things. Yeah, so thanks for listening, and I'm happy to take questions.